Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Shop Talk, hosted by Triangle Area SQL Server Users Group. And as always, we have with us Mala Mahadevan. How you doing, Mala?
Doing well, thank you. Hello everybody.
And as mostly, Mike Christensen. How's it going, Mike?
Bonjour. Bonjour. Hi. Doing well, thank you.
Good. So if this is your first time at Shop Talk, first, welcome. Second, we do want to mention this is a chat-driven program where I make tweaks to the UI in live conversation because I updated to the latest version of OBS Studio, and it looks like things changed just enough for me not to be able to have everything work nicely. This is why we can't have nice things, people. So speaking of having nice things, we have quite a few things lined up for tonight, but as always, this is chat-driven. You have chat, you have something to talk about, let's talk about it. Bring it up in chat, and we'll talk about it. Q&A, sometimes we have A's. Random comments, sometimes we have slightly less random responses. So bring it, and we'll return serve. But I do have a couple of topics for tonight. The first one is tri-pass elections. I warned you people about this last time, and you did not heed my warning. So now we have to have elections. Now, so every year, some percentage of the tri-pass board is up for a re-election, and this year we have 3 positions open. 3. I got to get it above the microphone. Position number 1 is El Presidente. So that would be currently me. Position number 2, Vice President of Marketing, which is Rick Pack. And position number 3, Treasurer, the person who absconds with all of our money. That's Mala. So these positions, we're going to have nominations open up. I'm going to send out an official email. So anybody who's a member of the TriPass meetup, congratulations, you're a member of TriPass and actually have voting rights and can drive the face of TriPass of the future, and all the horrors that may entail. So I will send out an official email. We'll get things kicked off. Voting doesn't start until the 3rd Thursday of November. We have plenty of time. This year, I wanted to make sure that I got it in early because last year I kind of forgot until the last minute and had to scramble to get an election because I forgot when the elections were going to be. Won't make that mistake this year. Instead, we're going to start election campaigns in April, just like in real life, April of the prior year. And we will inundate you with broadcasts constantly telling you, vote for TriPass, vote for me, vote for somebody. And no matter where you go, you're going to get these. We will spend hundreds of millions of dollars on campaign commercials for TriPass board membership. And there goes Mala just at that idea. So anyhow, I will send out that official email. Also, there is going to be an email sent out for a survey. We tend to run surveys every year or two just to get a feeling for the general audience. What does the Greek chorus have for us? And we'll send out one. Got a couple of questions already on the list, and we'll come up with a full set. But basically, question number 1, tolerance for in-person or really hybrid meetings. We're always going to we will continue to be online. I have the capture card back there. I have all of my equipment, so might as well just be online still. But incorporating in-person events where we're doing hybrid sessions, just like back in 2019. That'll be a question. Another question is the viability of hosting a SQL Saturday in Raleigh, March or April of next year. We won't do one for the fall. It's already too late for that. But spring of next year should be pretty good as far as times go. That's when we historically have done SQL Saturdays, at least since 2015. So seems like a pretty good time of the year to do it. Anyhow, that's all for the future. I'll send that email out probably late this week. And everybody who's a TriPass member, you're going to get that email. Some of you may even respond. Hopefully you do. So that is topic number 1. Topic number 2, Pass Summit is coming up. I think the prices did go up, but you can still use the discount code Azure175 to save a bit of scratch, specifically $175 worth of scratch, in case you need that much scratch, for your registration for Pass Summit. That is in Seattle or online. It's coming up in November. And I will be in Orlando at that point in time for Live 360, but I will have a presentation for Pass Summit. It was going to be a really good presentation, an amazing presentation, and I'm only overselling it a little bit. So those are the first 2 topics. The next topic is going to be for Mala, who is currently like a cat, where if you cover your eyes and can't see anybody, nobody else can see you. It turns out
what
that's
happened?
real.
Okay. I wasn't sure what it did on me. Okay, sorry about that. So I just want to take a minute to say something rather sober. If you worked in the SQL Server world for some time, at some point you may have read or used stuff that Hugo Cornelis created, especially around execution plans. Exceptionally smart person, based out of UK. Hugo has recently, sadly, been diagnosed with a serious cancer and is in hospital currently. So ask everybody to keep him in your thoughts and wish him speedy healing. Hugo, we love you and we wish for you to get well soon. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. We hope that everything goes well. And okay, hopefully everything goes well. We understand that there's some heavy duty chemo going on. Hugo has been keeping people up to date with blog posts, so if you do want to check that out, his website does have several updates along those lines, and hopefully he's back at it with the stuff that we enjoy Hugo for, which is index tuning and query performance and all kinds of outstanding work that he does. So, hopefully he's able to beat this thing, and we'll see him again. And while I am talking through that, let me grab his website and post the link in chat here in case you are interested in further.
Just posted, Kevin.
Oh, great. So
yeah, he's been very open, very honest about what's going on with his health. I'm not sure I would be that courageous, but please follow him if you feel inclined to and if you're able to.
Yeah. All right. With that, since Mala has the lens cap on, let's switch to.
What's going on with?
That's a good question. You might want to, if it may help to just stop sharing camera and then reshare camera. Okay. Maybe that'll trick the system into thinking that everything's fine again.
Okay.
But while we're fighting that, let's talk a little bit about SQL Server 2022. Late last week, Microsoft quietly dropped notice that SQL Server 2022 RC1 is now available for us. So that is now in the public domain as of September 22nd, exactly 1 month after the RC0. So prognostication is holding with regard to release. My expectation would be that we're going to have either one more RC or they'll go straight to RTM.
It's really weird, Kevin. I'm still getting a dark screen on Twitch, but I'm okay with whereby.
Yeah, I'm not able to see you here. So whatever is going on, you're not showing up through whereby.
So strange.
But we can hear you just fine. So we have our remote correspondent Mala, who's out in the field.
We make it a Halloween special.
Right. So if you are interested in grabbing RC1, those bits are available on Windows. I don't know if the container has been released for RC1 just yet. I should probably. This is what we do before the show, where we actually say, "Hey, let's figure out what we're going to talk about," and then we go find links and sort things out. But you know what? We're doing it live, people. We're doing it live. So tag. In case you are interested in the SQL Server container, it is at Docker Hub, and mcr.microsoft.com is the container registry for Microsoft, the artifact registry, and they do have SQL Server 2022 latest tag, but the question is going to be whether or not that is RC1 or RC0. So we'll have to sort that out at some point. It looks like the last updated time was September 1st, so it's probably RC0 for 2022 latest.
And would you deploy that with like Ubuntu in Docker?
The Docker image itself is based off of Ubuntu 2004.
Okay.
In other words, when you run Docker run and build off of an image and create a container, the base OS for the SQL Server container is Ubuntu 2004. You could run that from Windows, from Mac OS, from Ubuntu, from SUSE, Red Hat Enterprise. I was going to joke and say Slackware, but I actually don't know that you could run Docker from Slackware. I would be interested in knowing, just for the sake of knowing. But given that I use Slackware as my distro that hasn't been updated in a good 15 years, I don't know. Maybe now I'm looking at it and saying, oh, Slackware 15 is actually available. So that Slackware is still actively maintained. So
Is it for Debian, or not to go off topic too much, but is it support multiple Linux distributions?
What's that, the SQL Server? Oh, no, Slackware is a distribution of Linux. It's neither Debian-based nor Red Hat-based. It was one of the classic distributions that was intended to be build your own system and make sure that you know what you're doing because you're going in the deep end.
Right.
And so there's that's the kind of distro it is. It's not a hold your hand distro. But
I thought you had the one that looked like Mac OS, but maybe you have multiple.
No, that's Elementary OS, and that is the one that I have, and I refuse to say that it looks like Mac OS.
Hey, roll the tape, people.
But yeah, anyhow, container's not going to be available just yet. We should be able to get to the container, I would say, probably in a week, given what it looked like for RC0, where it took them about 1 week to get that packaged. So probably we'll get RC1 in a container next week, and then we're on the lookout to see, will there be an RC2, or do we go straight to RTM? Now, big thing for SQL Server 2022 RC1 is that there were no big things for RC1. This looks like it was entirely bug fixes. I didn't see anything in terms of syntax. I didn't see anything in terms of major functionality. I could have just missed it. But I didn't even see a real release notes, which means probably not going to have any major new functionality dropping between now and RTM. And so what that does to timelines, you make the call. I have a thought about when it will launch, because when RC0 came out, we were saying, I could see this. I was saying, with no non-public information, that, I could see this launching at Ignite or at Past Summit, considering that the last several versions of SQL Server tended to launch at one of those two events. And Ignite would be coming up in October. Would basically say if RC1 is essentially it, then they do some last second bug fixes and drop this thing for Ignite. If they need to, they could drop an RC2 and then announce it past Summit. But those two options are certainly on the board. And given the behavior that RC1 doesn't have anything new in it except for bug fixes, we may be seeing it come out pretty soon. So we'll definitely see it come out by the end of the year. Otherwise, they'll be very embarrassed by having SQL Server 2022 come out in 2023. So that, unlikely to happen. So that's SQL Server 2022 updates. Like I said, there's not much on there. And now let's talk a little bit. Let's do a rant. But we're going to do something different. We're going to have Mala do the rant tonight.
So, my rant, what Kevin calls a rant, it wasn't much of a rant, to be honest.
We'll make it one.
I don't mind it being called that. It actually came from the blog post that Kevin had most recently around the bit manipulation and the problems. That is again based on what Itzig Bengan said about the latest bit functions, and that the room, if developers begin to interpret something in a different way in their code, then the logic somewhat gets transferred from the database into that code, and then it becomes a problem sometimes. Like the problem I was dealing with, it wasn't exactly this, but it was the business situation was somewhat similar in the sense that the developer wanted, I had stored some IDs in a table, and I had a lookup table that interpreted those IDs a certain way, but the developer wanted me to add a special interpretation for it. Like, this number one means this, but that's not exactly what it means in the lookup table. So they wanted a special scenario which was different from the normal join we do to the lookup table to pull the description of whatever that means. So what do you do when you're faced with that kind of a situation, when you have to interpret something in ways that are different from what they're supposed to mean?
It's a good question.
That was kind of my question. That was something I did not really want to do, but I was asked to do something like that.
Yeah, that is a solid question. I wanted to let it sit there first to see if we get any takers in chat. What would you do there? You make the call. The way I would interpret it, and then after we're done with this, I'm going to pivot to another take on what Mala was talking about here, and take it just a slightly different direction. But when it comes to, hey, we have an established table that explains what these values represent, and you want this particular query to reinterpret those values in some other way, then I think there's a couple of natural questions that come up. And the first question is, does it make sense that this group is interpreting them in that way? So that's kind of the first question is, does this make sense? Given the logic of that within that group, not thinking about the company as a whole, not thinking about the data as a whole, but specifically the particular use case that they're looking at. So as an example, let's say I have customer A, customer B, customer C, and those are all in some region. And I could create a query that normally does lookups and says, oh, this is customer A, this is customer C, this is customer A, this is customer B. Or I can have a query that looks them up and says, okay, well, these are all in the region. And if we normally look things up by customer and we store the customers, then building out some special logic that says, oh, by the way, these customers are in the region and these customers are in the other region, then it can make internal logical sense. From there, you raise the question, is this a hierarchical relationship where normally we store things at the lowest level of granularity, and maybe we need to include something that's at a coarser grain? Like I was saying, customers and regions, where we're grouping things together. And if that's the case, could that be stored in the lookup table itself? Because it seems like it makes sense to that we have a region ID or a region name that ties to a region table if there's more information. So we have this, concept of, all right, well, if the grain is coarser, then sure, it's easy to support that and probably should make that support official. Now, if the grain is finer, then you've got a problem because you have company A, and I want to break that out into company A and company A, department 1, department 2, department 3. We need some way to break this out. And once you start having rules that say, well, if the invoice number is between X and Y, and this is company A, then it's really department 3. Now we start getting a bit hazy, and I begin to question the data model. I probably questioned it earlier than that, but I really begin to question the data model at that point and say, what is going on here? What awful hacks are you trying to fit in here? And
Well,
go for it, Mike.
so as the least experienced, that's my role. Since I started after you guys, that'll be forever. So it's just so when you have like a lot of developers on a larger team, when I see things like that, I'm kind of like, if it's tricky, you're gonna make mistakes. If you make mistakes, it's harder to troubleshoot. I'm just looking at this example that's a bitwise operation of storing fax numbers as a 1 or a 0 flag on or off, and I'm like, the level of complexity here is like pretty extreme, and the odds of making a mistake are pretty high.
No, Kevin's point is that if you let developers interpret it a certain way, then it is on them to maintain whatever that is, whatever that means in the future, which
Right.
is valid for this, and it's valid for a number of other situations where you have to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would extend it as well to say, okay, it is on the developers to interpret it, and also to think beyond what is important for this particular use case and into a general case, and say, what's the likelihood that some other team, some other part of the company is going to interpret it in the same way? What is the likelihood that they're going to interpret in a different way? And what is the likelihood that a person, a user, will view one interpretation, draw inferences from that information, view a different interpretation, and draw different inferences from that information? Both inferences may in fact be correct, but they may also be seemingly contradictory. There may be a paradox involved, and resolving the paradox usually involves going back to the developers and having them sort out what's going on here. A classic example of this is if you start talking about accounting methods and techniques. Even something as simple as how do you round? If you're using banker's rounding versus classic rounding, the mechanisms are different. And so you may end up with different results when you perform your financial calculations, both of which are correct given the assumption that you use this particular method of rounding. And a person could look at those two numbers, draw different inferences, and both of them are, again, technically correct given the assumption. But they are not the same, which means that there's some clarification required. And so you do run that risk. However, there are enough cases where, yeah, we just need to see this data, especially in an aggregated way or in a specialized way, that fine, let's create the stored procedure and have a case statement that performs this operation that breaks it out the way we need to see it. And if it's that one time, okay. When you start saying these 6 stored procedures that all need the same case statement, that's where the question becomes, is there a way that we're able to turn this into proper data logic or into business logic, or that we're able to reshape the question in such a way that we don't need this consistent case operator that is generating information for us? And if so, well, let's see how we can do it, because that's probably going to be saner in the end, as you'll have the operation itself happen in one place as opposed to happening in a half dozen places. And then if the structure changes, if the calculation changes ever so finely, we might miss spots where it's located. So that is a significant risk of that kind of onesie twosie approach to operating on lookup data.
Mm-hmm.
But one place where I wanted to take this is a slightly different formulation that Mala and I were talking about last time around, and that is surrogate keys having business value. And this is something that I've seen in quite a few places. Sometimes that business value is understandable. Like, for example, you have lookup lists where 0 is unknown. Okay, I do that all the time. It's okay. And then the real values start at 1 and increment upward. Where things get a little bit more interesting is having positive numbers represent one thing and negative numbers represent a different thing. So, for example, positive numbers represent user-defined values. Negative numbers represent system-defined values. So we may have what is your supplier name, and we have a suppliers table, and instead of having a supplier type that is represented by system provided supplier and user provided supplier, if to the extent that is necessary, we have positive numbers are user supplied and negative numbers are system supplied, and hopefully we never have a overflow for our identity values. Which, okay, just use big int, we'll never have an overflow. But then you have some sort of system logic, and especially when the positive values join to one set of tables and the negative values join to different tables. So now if I do an inner join of my core table with some explanatory information, all of a sudden I've got 2 paths that I need to follow, and either 2 sets of joins or a union all, each of which is joined. And that can end up being a little bit of a mess for development as well. And by a little bit of a mess, I mean probably a lot of a mess. And that's the type of thing that I think clever developers come up with, and not realizing that that cleverness ends up getting them into a trap. And especially when you could easily just have, this is a supplier ID, but then you have a supplier type ID. That supplier's type ID, system generated or user generated. If you do need to keep those separate, then you can have sort of a parent-child relationship with tables, where you have a supplier and a table, and maybe you've got a system supplier table and a user supplier table. And so user supplier and system supplier both have supplier IDs. You generate that supplier record and its corresponding child record, and then you have to worry about ensuring that if there's a possibility that you may have a switch between a system and a user supplied table or data, then you have to double check that data is in these tables and that it's not in both of the tables, and et cetera, et cetera. Which you can do. You can certainly do that with triggers. You can have foreign key constraints to the supplier table. You can have triggers that ensure that data is in one but not the other. And there's nothing that'll that's a drastic business challenge for that, except for the possibility that both of those are incredibly active tables, in which case you may not want that trigger. But in most cases, that sounds like the type of thing where, hey, you're creating one of those every day or one of those every hour. And if you have a trigger call that runs every hour, I don't care. If you have 9 million a minute, I care. I really care. But in those cases,
that'll trigger Kevin.
A little, yeah. I see what you did there. Well, I don't know. It depends. How much I'm getting paid for it. So that was where I wanted to go with that second option. That was trying to impart business logic on surrogate keys, and that's usually not a great place to be. It's you're trying to overload the notion of a value that is not supposed to represent anything. The entire surrogate key concept is this thing has no value. The one major exception is in a warehouse, the date dimension, where the surrogate key for the date is usually the date in integer value format. So like 20220926, which would represent September 26th of 2022. The reason being that it is really easy for a human to read that and understand what the date is, and dates have so much significance in fact tables that we might as well just use them. But otherwise, those surrogate keys are just supposed to represent a pointer to a value, and the specifics of the pointer itself should be completely irrelevant to the caller as long as they have that pointer. But because we are humans, we tend to try to overload as many things as we can, and this is why we can't have nice things. So Mala, you had another topic that wasn't going to be quite as ranty, but is transferring a list to a table versus doing it in code.
Which one, Kevin? Say again.
Transferring a list to a table versus doing it in code.
Oh yeah. Oh that. Yeah. Yeah. That. That's another problem that we run into quite often where I work, is that we have code that has this really long list of values that we need to check on. And for whatever reason, there are many reasons. There's not one reason. Whatever reason, those things were not, I can understand a handful of values, not worth the hassle. That's okay. But sometimes we have hundreds of them, like literally written down in code. So I can understand that some tables have no purpose, like nothing, it's static data pretty much. But I still believe you should put that sort of stuff in tables as much as you can, not in code. Do you agree, Kevin?
Generally, I do, yeah. Especially if you're going to write queries to hit that code. I will say, my own development, I will have enumerations that where I'm representing lookup data in the code, so that I don't have to pull in a list of values from a database in order to parse them. And I will also have a table in the database that represents those same values. And yes, there is some management in keeping those up to date, keeping those synced. I think it has a big benefit. That benefit is simplicity in the code, which can translate very easily to sending the right value into the database. And then inside the database, you can join two tables and immediately get information on what user type ID 7 actually represents, instead of having to try to dig it out of the code. Especially as an organization grows larger, where the code base is bigger, where the number of people who know what user type ID equals 7 means decreases as those people phase out. They move to other projects, they move to other teams, they move to other companies. There comes a time when nobody knows exactly what user type ID 7 actually represents, and then you send one of the developers spelunking until they figure out what it is. And maybe if you're lucky, they find it out pretty quickly. If you're unlucky, they find 3 different references to what user ID 7 means or user type 7 is, because, well, other developers kind of forgot what it represented over time and had it mean different things. Or that there were 3 different things called user type ID because they come from different databases, and now you have to sort out which one is which. Or that user type ID 7 doesn't have any representation in current code because it was part of old deprecated code that the database people didn't know about and therefore couldn't clean up. So having that understanding inside the database also helps because it ensures that your user type ID is valid, that 7 is in fact a valid number. It could turn out that really we only have 6 user types, 1 through 6, and 7 was never a correct number, but it got into the database because we were trusting the application to do data integrity, which is not usually a good idea. So as a result, well, we have user type ID 7 in here, and what does that represent? It represents an error state, but we don't know that until we pull the data back in, and maybe the application just swallows it because we have Pikachu developers. And if you don't know what that reference means, Pikachu developers are the ones who have try catch blocks around everything, and usually the catch is empty. So you got to catch them all. And well, they just continue on with life because whatever. Sometimes you find horrible things like that as a result of this, and I consider that data mismanagement. You've got bad data, you have faulty data, and there's an easy way to represent what is correct. This is where we get to the value of foreign key constraints, that they ensure that I can represent valid states and I cannot represent invalid states. That is one of the mantras of functional programming, that we make invalid states unrepresentable. That has its own meaning in FP world, but in the data world, we have that same capacity, we have that same calling, and we have tools that really help get us there. One of which is that we have that data stored in appropriate lookup tables with foreign key constraints.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
I agree, Mala, too. And actually Kevin offline was helping me with something where I'll give you another case example where it's useful. Is like some of those IDs are like considered PHI. So when we use source control, we have a rule like you can't have like where patient ID is in this list of 10 patients because that is getting committed into GitLab, and we don't want any PHI in any of the code. So that we would rather it be like in cohort for arthritis or whatever table you created, instead of doing an in statement in all over the place, which has happened in the past. So that's one thing. And then another thing is I have these clients that I don't want them creating tables. So Kevin had an idea of like taking their data as a JSON object and then putting it into a stored procedure and sending it back. So that's more off topic, but I was really hesitant to have my 75 users being able to create tables.
Yeah, I'm generally against that idea. I tend to be very possessive about database development.
Well, and they're connecting through R, and for the most part, and they're data scientists, and so 1,000.
They're going to write poor
10,000. They're gonna make an in list that's over 10,000.
Yeah.
Well, in Oracle, you can do the tuplet thing where you can get up to 10,000, but usually it's 1,000. So yeah, they max that stuff out because of their privileges. So we're trying to figure out a better way to do that.
Yeah, and some of that is just the tooling. In R, if you're using RODBC or I forget the other library, but there are strong limitations to how you can represent T-SQL code there. And the easy way ends up being something that isn't good. It's not it is valid T-SQL or PLSQL or whatever dialect of SQL you need, but it's usually not well written. It's usually auto-generated and runs the risk of not performing very well because, like you were saying, Mike, there's just a giant list instead of a join operation to a table.
Right. So you might be missing records and not know it.
Sure. Or have a bad value and end up with a result set that's quite different from what you expected. So that is a problem with tooling, and I do know that RODBC, for example, likes to save data as new tables. They love to create new tables. And in those cases, I tend to be a little more flexible and just give a dumping ground where I understand that this is garbage land. You can put as much stuff as you want in garbage land. None of that stuff is going to be valid for proper querying. When you're ready for proper querying, talk to me and we'll sort out how to get it into the appropriate world of databases. But have fun in garbage land. Have fun in that scratch database. Do whatever you need to do in there, and then we'll talk about it. And that's the approach that that I have used to some success. I mean, I don't call the database garbage land usually.
I was going to say, Rick's going to have to help us with some marketing on that.
Right.
It better not be garbage land.
I mean,
I've worked at places where it is. Sure. Yeah.
Landfill Carnival, we'll call it.
Right, the Landfill Carnival. Yeah, I like that. It's very festive. Of course, that also usually describes the main OLTP system. So then the question is, what's the difference? And before we even get to discussing ERPs, if ever you have wanted to have the life sucked out of you, and not in a good way, check out ERP data, the way ERPs are set up, and imagine having to work with those all day. And you will appreciate the awful systems that you have because at least they're not PeopleSoft. Unless you do.
I was going to ask you what you meant, like SAP and PeopleSoft and.
Yep, that's exactly, and Great Plains and pretty much all of them. They're all designed in such a way that they all tend to be nightmares. And part of it is that, well, you have to design for accounting systems that are always rather funky. You have to have all of these processes in place and be able to handle various types of operations and do things that normal humans would blanch at. So I do understand that the nature of the scenario, the problem is that you're trying to create a generic solution to a common problem that has many, many, many separate requirements, where each company essentially has their own set of requirements, which is why you don't typically have PeopleSoft installations. You have PeopleSoft developers and PeopleSoft implementations and constant PeopleSoft development managing those PeopleSoft implementations, where it essentially becomes its own development system.
And you can track all that in your ServiceNow implementation.
Right. And that's a place where some developers go. I don't know what they did in a prior life to deserve that, but it must have been bad.
Now, do you mean, are you talking about like application developers, like on the front end, or are you talking about like how they get the data out?
No, usually it is usually it's front end developers, yes. And those front end developers also end up structuring the PeopleSoft tables.
Oh, gotcha.
So you rarely have data or database people developing implementations, generally they're business rule driven by application developers who also meddle in databases as a side project.
Gotcha.
Versus data architecture, because you're limited in your data architecture capacity. You have to work with what PeopleSoft provides and the way that they provide it. I'm using PeopleSoft as the example over and over because that's the one I'm most familiar with. But again, this also applies to SAP. It applies to Great Plains. It applies to all of the major players, that you work with the tools that they have provided. They give you the capacity to develop out these business rules and to store information in ways that normal humans would never make sense of. SharePoint's the same way, where if you've ever gone through and tried to understand how data is stored in SharePoint, it is madness. It is walking through a hall of mirrors and seeing all this data scattered about in different ways, in different shapes, and like, hey, that's squat data. That's really tall data. That data is going to kill me.
SCOM is similar.
SCOM, yeah.
So when I used to work in support, I worked in supporting SCOM in a database capacity at one place where I was, and every weekend we had to pull a report on the server uptime for the people, the big bosses. And this thing, the way it stored data, it would capture it at such a granular level, like every 2 seconds, right? It would be doing polling and write one entry for that. And before the week was done, the database and the logs have all filled up. So we had to keep exporting it to some other place to pull that report. Export it and then delete it. And sometimes, the report would be needed right in the middle of that thing going on. And it's like, what's going on here? Why is it so hard to pull a simple report? It's because of how the data is stored. Sorry, too much data. There's no aggregation. And
right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep. It's like, that's where you write your own aggregation and your own reporting and your own tooling and hope for the best. Hope that it doesn't change with the next update.
No, if you look at it behind it's designed by somebody in Microsoft. It's just, it's unbelievable how poorly designed it is. Unbelievable.
Oh, I believe it.
Yeah.
When you look at most Microsoft implementations of databases were not designed with database professionals. That's the gentle way of putting it. The less gentle way of putting it is, have you ever opened up MSDB and seen the carnage that is SQL Agent? That is, I was going to say replication. Replication is relatively sane compared to a lot of the other stuff, but reporting services...
And replication has gotten better too. They may put some fixes in and they made it a lot better. MSDB and Agent, for sure.
Reporting services. The integration services catalog isn't the worst database. The way the SQL Agent works is probably the worst that SQL Server has. Some of the definitions,
quite a bit.
System stored procedures. Yep. If you try to run any kind of deprecation checker, you will find system stored procedures that pop up using stuff that was deprecated several versions ago that just hasn't been changed. And then any kind of third party, still Microsoft, but any outside of SQL Server solution that includes SQL Server, Team Foundation Server, kind of an ugly database structure. I only say kind of because I haven't worked with it in more than a decade, so I don't remember how ugly it was. I just remember it being pretty ugly. SharePoint, like I mentioned, that's a historical laughingstock. The Great Plains is let's build a platform to build a platform to build a financial system. SPT underscore values. Yeah, that where it was intended to be every possible string, if I remember right. That's kind of an ugly thing to look at. And most of these are examples of what not to do. do not design your database like this. Do not design your functions or your stored procedures like this. But they were written by developers. This app developers doing it in Microsoft's environment just as much as it's app developers doing it in everybody else's environments. And so as a result, you have people who aren't going to be that familiar. The irony is they're very familiar with the product, but they're very familiar with the C++ code that builds the database, not with the practices of database architecture and of database modeling and database implementation. There are certainly and obviously people on the SQL Server teams who are very familiar with that, but usually the developers are about as familiar with a database as any other developer is at any other company. That they can write some level of SQL statement and can fake their way across, but won't know the first thing about what normal forms represent and won't understand the importance of data modeling. Their goal is, just like everybody else, I got to get this thing done on a deadline, so I'm just going to get it done as fast as I can.
I noticed too in my career, like a lot of consulting firms push work down the ladder, right? So you get sometimes your new analysts who just got their MBA or whatever, they're the ones doing it.
Oh yeah.
So it just saves the company money. I'm sure Bob Ward doesn't code every line.
No. I mean, he does.
No,
he does some.
Buck Woody had once explained why, not exactly why, but he said that the SharePoint team was under a lot of stress without the right resources, which is why that
Mhm.
the way it is that they really didn't have database people to guide them or help them with the design, and they were under tremendous pressure to get the product out. That's
Yeah.
what he said. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a standard story with any company.
Right.
Microsoft's not going to be any different. They're not going to, just because they build the product doesn't mean that they're going to use it right. And same thing with Oracle, same thing elsewhere. When Oracle has applications that build databases.
But not all software companies build database products, Kevin. That's my beef.
This is true.
You have a best-selling database product, your product. And if you want to dish out this sort of stuff, then I don't know what to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, you would think that,
Right.
I mean, especially if you're working on the product itself, you would think that you would have a way to reach out to somebody who does know how to do this well and say, hey, can you model this out? But again, deadlines.
But if you've ever opened a call with Microsoft that involves multiple teams, you'll know how that works.
Right. It is one hand not knowing what the other is doing.
What the other is saying.
That's that's hilarious, because you could be like getting some coffee and you're like, hey, what do you do? Nice to meet you. Oh, I work on SharePoint. What do you do? I work on a SQL Server. Oh man, I wish I talked to you like 3 weeks ago, because we already shipped.
There's one thing I don't miss at my current job. It's Microsoft support calls. Oh my goodness. No.
Yeah, that's fair. And well, also the other thing is, you joke about that, Mike, but they're usually in different buildings.
Right.
I believe it. Yeah.
Yeah, there's over 100 buildings on Microsoft's Redmond campus.
Yeah. But in today's world, physical locations do not get in the way of people collaborating. Today's world, I can understand back in the days.
Oh boy, 100 people.
100 buildings.
100 buildings.
I rode my bike by Microsoft here in Montreal just again today.
Yeah, and that doesn't include all of the subsidiary offices, all of the other locations. So yeah, the likelihood that a SharePoint person would go now, there's only a few different places that serve lunch, so you're more likely to find somebody. But also, I mean, come on, we're developers. When we go to lunch, we go in small clusters and stay with those, afraid to leave the small group. So the chance that you're going to sit down and actually talk to another human, nah, forget that.
Might bump into.
And you have to teach developers, at least my experience, most developers, that if you need database help, please ask. Please
Right.
ask. Don't come up with your own amateur solutions. Please ask. We're here to help. Please ask.
Which, that's it's a little bit of what we try to do on Shop Talk. Just a little bit. Most is just to make fun of things. But sometimes we try to help. But it's like I said, it's going to be the same at every company. Every big company has deadlines. Every big company has groups who, hey, if you had just known to talk to me, I could have helped you out with this problem because I happen to be an expert in this thing. We're picking on SQL Server development as an example because we are all very familiar with it. But there's plenty of other things within a large company that, oh, yeah, I happen to know all about this cost-based accounting system that the company has implemented, but you didn't know to talk to me, and so you went off and did something that was half-baked and is very weird and doesn't quite work right. But a large part of the company is now dependent on it because that's the thing that rolled out to production. And I didn't know that you were working on it because that information just doesn't filter. Even when companies try to filter that information, you end up getting a fire hose, and the subject matter experts end up, nope, not even going to look at what everybody else is doing because I got my own stuff to do. I'm too busy. Which that has happened where even with smaller companies, okay, what's everybody working on? And by about the third person in, you start plugging your ears because I don't have time or capacity to keep in mind what everybody else is working on if they're outside of my team. I have my domain. When we get outside of my domain, sorry, I have to trust that other people are going to do what they need to do. And that mentality, which I think is a perfectly reasonable mentality, it's a thing that keeps us sane because you can't
work 100 hours a week,
right?
Talk to everybody.
Exactly. It doesn't scale at all. Even when you get past tiny company, when you get past startup phase, knowing what everybody in the company is doing at any point in time, not possible.
Yeah.
So then we try to come up with mechanisms to say, well, if you have a problem with this, talk to this person. But even so, we have deadlines, we have personal relationships, we have things where, you know what, I don't need to talk to that person. I know enough about accounting. I've taken several accounting courses, so I'm good. I'll just roll with it. And as a result, you may end up with something fine. You may end up with something that's garbage. Or
you might program it as FIFO and it's supposed to be LIFO. Uh-oh.
I mean, that's a thing that can happen. But maybe the comparison might be it functionally works, but is inefficient and not a good pattern for other people to adopt, which is really important if you're a company that provides a major platform of software for people to develop off of to show good patterns. Even the sample databases are more to show off all the features than to show off good practices. AdventureWorks, Wide World Importers are not designed for good practices necessarily. They're not maliciously designed. It's not like they're intended to be anti-patterns. But in many cases, oh, well, AdventureWorks, you know what? We're debuting file stream, so we need a file stream file group in here. We need to show how file stream works. All right, let's shoehorn file stream in. Oh, well, we're releasing this thing, so we need this involved. With Wide World Importers, like in-memory OLTP, we need a memory-optimized file group here. Well, you really don't, given the scenario here. But part of it is you're demonstrating that, yeah, here's how a memory-optimized file group might work with memory-optimized tables, and have fun with that. But as for whether it actually makes sense for the scenario at hand, no.
Well, this is a plug for Brent because he got in his course. He has like 4 versions of Stack Overflow that's a couple months behind, and then he uses it 4 flavors based on your machine and like what he's trying to demonstrate, that like the behavior of the 5 core 32 gigabytes bigger data is going to be a lot different than the small one, and that when you're using AdventureWorks or whatever, you're not going to be replicating a work an enterprise level behavior.
Yeah,
So
that's true.
I like that. I like that he put a lot of effort into that. So he has like 4 versions of the database that you can work off of for exercises.
Yep. And we have reached the top of the hour, so we're going to wrap it up for tonight. Got a few things knocked out here. Remember, we will be sending out an email with some survey questions. So when those survey questions come out, we would definitely appreciate people taking a few minutes to share their thoughts, and it'll help drive the future of the organization. But until, let's see, tomorrow, we do have our business intelligence data science meetup. It's going to be a talk, 6 p.m. Eastern time, 5 p.m. Central. And then we're done for the month, and we'll pick back up in October. So until we see each other again, everybody, take care.
Bye, everyone. Good night.
Au revoir.